My name is Julia, I'm a freelance photographer from Berlin and I'm quite heavily into sneakers, so some people also know my alter ego SneakerQueen. One of the main pairs that really got me into collecting or into that state of mind of a collector was Jordan 4 Cement. When that released in '99, I already had a couple of sneakers that I collected, but still that shoe was the first one that I was really fiending over. So I remember going to the store over and over again and asking the people to put the shoe on hold over a month, I think, because it took quite some time until I got the money together to buy them. Well, I think if you started collecting in the 90s, Jordan was definitely an important brand to have represented in your collection. I think altogether basketball shoes were very popular in the 90s. If you were collecting, running wasn't really a subject, it was more basketball shoes. So yeah, I think Jordans were a brand that was a heavy influence in being a status symbol, and that of course influenced me as well. But I believe my first sneakers that I actually chose as sneakers were Converse. I think Converse One Stars, lows with really heavy dark green suede. So I remember those and getting those of my parents. But yeah, the first real collecting shoe was, I think, the Jordan 4. It's quite impossible to say how many shoes I have. I really don't count, and I think it helps my sanity not to think too much about how many pairs I have. I do have some pairs in storage, so I don't have to think about them too much. But I would estimate I own probably around 1,000 pairs. I love collecting vintage because it has a total different aura to a retro shoe or a new shoe, because you can really see the history through the patina in a shoe. I think vintage is also something that has a whole different rule when it comes to scarcity. Nowadays shoes are very hyped and people are feeling that they are scarce and they're very limited, but I do feel that vintage shoes are much more limited because they're not being produced anymore, definitely not being produced in that quality, in that shape. So for me, vintage is really a new definition of rare shoes. And also I really love the history and the stories that come with vintage shoes. So when you have a vintage shoe, usually they are worn. If they are not worn and in pristine condition, then it's really like opening a little bit of a time capsule when you open that box. So I really love that feel of stories behind and history behind a shoe on a vintage sneaker. I think the difference between value and price is really an interesting concept to think about when you're talking about sneaker collecting. I think hype means value to a lot of people, and I think a lot of new collectors are heavily influenced by hype, of course. I mean, hype doesn't go past me either. Like every now and then I do have that hype twitch and I see a shoe and I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I should get that. But it's usually because I actually like the model or the execution of the model. And I think this is really a symptom of collectors who are just starting collecting or consumers who are just getting into sneakers, that hype is such a big factor and such a high value point for them. And after some years, when you kind of get over the fact that hype shoes lose their, I don't want to say lose their value with when the hype is lost, but it does decrease the value a bit. And what I really like about sneaker collecting is finding my own value for my collection. So when people ask me what's your most valuable shoe, it's usually not a shoe that is very high in price, but very high in sentimental value. And I think this difference is something that you find out the longer you collect or the more shoes you have, of course. This is a model from Japan, and in Japanese schools, when you have a sports team, then they usually divide it into red and white or blue and red team, but red is always one of the team colors. And this shoe actually has the word red printed, or not printed, but somehow marked on the heel. It looks like somebody went over there with the pen and drew it on there. And so this lets me suggest that the shoe was actually used in a Japanese school, preschool or whatever, for the teams, for the kids to wear. And I think this is just such a cool little historical document. So I love this pair. I think patina is such a nice aspect of a shoe. I personally don't like wearing shoes in a used look. I'm not the type of person who will wear their shoes so they actually get their own patina. I like shoes being super clean and looking like new, but I do appreciate the patina behind vintage shoes because the materials from the 80s age totally different like materials do nowadays. And I think this is also part of the sentimental value for me, that aging process of different materials that you will not find on shoes anymore today. So I think my collection consists mostly of Adidas and Nike, but apart from that I do have mostly all other brands. So I do have Puma, I do have Vans, I do have Reebok, I have Converse, and I don't really discriminate about the brand. I'm more interested in the design of a shoe, and mainly my interest in collecting sneakers is being interested in socio-cultural backgrounds of sneakers and the stories that come culturally with sneakers, which is probably also the reason why I'm not too much into hype sneakers. I do buy hype sneakers every now and then, but to me it has a total different value than a shoe that is just hyped by the masses. I was very fortunate to be able to work on quite a lot of sneaker-related projects, which actually stems from the fact that I am very interested in sneaker culture and socio-cultural backgrounds of sneakers, and therefore I organize a lot of exhibitions and curate a lot of stuff around sneakers. And in 2013 I was asked by Adidas to make my own shoe or do my own take on my favorite silhouette. And I was lucky enough to be one of the people who they asked to participate in the Collectors Project. I made a Rivalry high in a white and grey silhouette. White and grey shoes, for me personally, are the perfect color combination for sneakers. I was never allowed to wear white sneakers as a child. I was very much a tomboy, so my mom never let me wear any white sneakers, and that of course left a dent in my mind about white sneakers, and I really prefer white sneakers nowadays. And since then, since my collaboration with Adidas, I've been lucky enough to do a couple of more collaborations. I did a collaboration with LS on a LS tanker, and last year I was fortunate enough to do a collaboration with my good friend Kishkash on a kangaroo silhouette. We went for the ultimate. Next collaboration is hopefully not too far away. There are quite a lot of shoes and brands that I would love to work on. I've been doing a lot of consulting in the last few years for numerous brands, but having the chance to collaborate, for example, on a Nike shoe would definitely be really nice. The Nike structure used to be one of my favorite models, actually. This is the women's version, for example. But what I love about this structure is actually that it's a shoe that was, like the Air Max, had a development. So there's actually a structured Nike Air Structure 2, which is a really interesting shoe, but only from the inside. On the outside it looks like this, but on the inside it has a really interesting footbridge. And I think this footbridge is really amazing on this model. So I like to collect these in-between models, but also see a timeline, a continuation of the development of the models. And I think this is a really nice example of a shoe and its development. You can see these elements that were used on the original being reinterpreted on this one. So this is the shoe that I actually did for the Collectors Project. It's called Rivalry SneakerQueen. And my take on the silhouette was very classic. Like I mentioned, I love white sneakers. White and grey, to me, actually is the perfect color combination on a sneaker, in my opinion. So this was a really easy decision to make. Premium leather and nice snakeskin grey stripes was for me the ultimate thing. And also I did a lot of details on this shoe. For example, the insole on the shoe is inspired by the old Patrick Ewing paper, that box paper that you would find in the collection in the shoes, and also the logo on the inside, the SneakerQueen logo, is inspired by a Patrick Ewing logo. I actually wanted to do the Patrick Ewing logo, but obviously there were some legal issues, so I went for a SneakerQueen version of that logo, and I was actually the first one to reinterpret this Ewing type logo. Nowadays I find it quite commonly used, but I'm a bit proud that I was the one who had the idea to do this. So I quite like seeing the development in styles at the moment, and I think the time is right for certain basketball silhouettes to be re-released by brands. I think there's a huge potential for old Nike basketball silhouettes being re-released, but also for Adidas or for New Balance. I think we've seen a little bit of a rise in interest for Avia shoes, probably because of the background that Avia was a big inspiration for shoes that, for example, Louis Vuitton did and so on. I think for me as a vintage collector, shape is really a big issue, and I've seen too many beautiful silhouettes being messed up with the wrong shape, so I'm very careful what I'm wishing for here. For basketball silhouette, I personally think the Adidas Status 1 would be an amazing silhouette to re-release, but it would take quite a lot of remaking molds and stuff like that to release that, because the shoe has so many interesting applications that you would have to make special molds for. So I get that this is not a low finance project. But one of my favorite silhouettes in Nikes are the Nike Air Support. I think this is a shoe that is highly underrated in the sense that it had the kind of the position of the Air Max Lite at some point, because the Air Max Lite was also one of these models that is just in between the Air Max 1 and the Air Max 90. So it is kind of the cousin of those two models, and with the Nike Air Support I feel similarly. I think the Support is a shoe that is kind of in between, but has an incredible design, has incredible materials, and if that shoe would, for example, be re-released in a nice shape, I mean, it would be an absolute amazing release. I've lent quite a few of my shoes to the Adidas archive. Adidas has digitalized their archive in the past. It's not online at the moment anymore, but I'm hoping that it will come back. And for the digitalization of their archive, I lent, for example, the Status 1 that I talked about. I've lent it to the archive. I lent numerous apparel pieces, I don't know, from the Run DMC collection. So this is the Adidas Eldorado, one of the shoes from the first collection that a sneaker brand did with a group, with a hip-hop group. Therefore, it was really an exceptional collection, because before that never has a brand dared to do a collaboration with actually a music group or a culturally inspired collaboration. Before that it was always just athletes, and if there were stars that were kind of seeded with special pairs, then they were made as special makeup, so-called SMU shoes. So this was the first real collaboration with a band, with a music band. You can see my pair is signed because I was lucky enough to meet DMC on several occasions for exhibitions that I did. This was actually signed in Tokyo when I did an exhibition, a huge Adidas exhibition in Tokyo in 2016, if I remember correctly, where we exhibited history of Adidas, over 700 pairs in Tokyo. Germany has quite a vivid vintage scene. A lot of German collectors started after the wall came down, so I think, of course, the Adidas equipment and ZX series is a very important and significant model series here in Germany. The three stripes obviously have a very different standing here than anywhere else in the world, and anybody who grew up in Germany definitely had a pair of Adidas on their feet when they were doing sports in school or so on. So I do like to believe that there is a strong vintage love here in Germany, but I do see a lot of collectors also just coming at it from the fashion viewpoint and being hype collectors. So it's really diverse, I would say. But I'm happy to hear that the perception of German collectors is vintage orientated. I really like that. I think Germans are fairly straight-edged when it comes to certain subjects. They don't like to make a lot of compromises about certain things, and I think when it comes to collecting, they have a very strong view of what their collection should consist of or not when it comes to vintage collecting. And I appreciate that in the scene, that they're really strong-minded about how they collect, and I really like that. I only see that similarity, I think, in Japan. So another shoe that I've been hunting for a very long time when I started collecting in the 90s was the Terminator, especially in the Hoyas colorway. The Terminator was a shoe that was actually made for the team, or the color, this specific colorway was made for the Hoyas team, and I was always hunting the player's edition of this shoe. The player's edition has, instead of Nike on the heel, it says Hoyas. So I've always hunted the player's edition of these, which after some years obviously I gave up, because it's just very unlikely that I'm gonna find a size 7 basketball player's edition shoe, because no basketball player is wearing a size 7, so obviously there's not gonna be one. The collecting fever is not going to go away for quite some time. I think every collector has their ups and downs and phases where they buy more or hunt more. It's the same for me at the moment. I have some other priorities in my life that are taking up more space. But there will come a phase again when I'm hunting a little bit more. And generally to say, yes, I'm always on the hunt, always. There's not a single day going by that I don't think about certain models, or I don't look something up, so the interest is still very, very strong. And I don't approach hunting in the sense that I go looking for something. If you have a specialized interest in something, you move through the world with a certain filter, and this filter brings you to see the world under certain aspects. And it's the same for me. If I go out or if I go online, I look at the world through the collector's filter, and maybe I see someone on the street and I see a pair of old shoes and I was like, oh my God, what is that? Or oh my God, I haven't seen that in such a long time, I really want that colorway or whatever. So that might happen, but in the same sense also online. I rediscover models. So after 30 years of collecting, I have a pretty good overview of what's out there. But being reminded of certain things always triggers the love for the design. So therefore, hunting is more of a process. If that crosses my mind or my path, then I will probably go for it. So I really don't mind traveling for sneakers. I love traveling anyway, and I'm really interested in the sneaker cultures around the world. This is also one of the ambitions that I have when I organize and curate exhibitions, because when I do an exhibition I always try to do it in some other country to interact with the communities there. When I was a teenager, I used to, in the summer holidays or in the summer break, I would go working for 4 weeks, and then with the money that I earned I would go to New York for 2 weeks and travel there with suitcases which were filled with bags, and then come back with tons of shoes. And in the last couple of years I've been doing the same thing also in Asia, so I love traveling to Japan. Tokyo has a very special place in my heart, so therefore I really like traveling there. Wherever you go, it's always super interesting to see that certain models are only made for certain markets, So for the Asian markets you find totally different models. Like in Japan you will find a model like the 4100 from Adidas, which is a model which wasn't released in Europe or the US, or for example the MR5 or Mr. V, like I like to call it, is also a silhouette that it was typically only released for the Asian market or Japanese market. And so I find these local specialities, I find these specifically interesting when I travel. It's impossible to name a favorite silhouette of mine, because it's like asking a DJ for his favorite record. It really depends on the mood and also on the category. Like if you would ask me, what's your favorite swoosh basketball silhouette, then I could tell you probably more, 2 or 3 models, or what's your favorite 3-stripe running, or whatever, you know. So there's too much to choose one to choose just a single favorite, I believe.